Thanks for clicking. Did the Bank of Canada print money to finance the federal government during COVID? The Bank of Canada recently tweeted that no, they did not. In a series of tweets dated August 25th, the Bank of Canada argued that they did not in fact print their way through COVID, as quantitative easing isn't printing money.
That's my boy right there.
The string of tweets from Canada's central bank comes as Canadians are getting increasingly frustrated with the higher levels of inflation and the increased cost of borrowing that has been implemented by the Bank of Canada to combat that higher cost of goods. Given that historically printing money is a surefire way of inducing ultra-high inflation, the Bank of Canada has obviously been under increased scrutiny for its actions during the pandemic. So what I want to do today is go over the Bank of Canada's tweets, discuss how in fact they did fund our way through the pandemic and why the bank says that they didn't print our way through it, and then go over the bank's moves to remove that money that they didn't print from the system. Speaking of the bank's actions, we are set to receive their interest rate announcement mid-next week, which will obviously have a big impact on Canada's economy and Canada's real estate market going forward. We'll obviously have an update out on the announcement on this channel. If you want to get that update, make sure you click like and subscribe. But for now, let's get into the bank's tweets. The Bank of Canada said in its tweets on the 25th that it did not, in fact, print money during the pandemic. What it did was buy government bonds from banks using settlement balances, a kind of central bank reserve, not, in fact, using banknotes. So they didn't use physical currency. The bank went on to say that these settlement balances that they used to purchase these bonds do not permanently add money to the system, and the bank can remove them from the system whenever they want, which is what they're doing, which is quantitative tightening, which we'll get into in a few minutes. So the Bank of Canada is saying they didn't print money because they used settlement balances to buy these government bonds from the banks. These tweets raise a number of questions, mainly what are settlement balances and how did the Bank of Canada spend them? According to the Bank of Canada's website, settlement balances are a unique type of money that the central bank creates. The money that is created by the Bank of Canada vis-a-vis the settlement balances is then deposited into the accounts of member banks at the Bank of Canada. Settlement balances are funds that the Bank of Canada creates vis-a-vis a keystroke, which are then deposited into the accounts of member banks, the big banks that hold accounts at the Bank of Canada. So if the question is, did former Bank of Canada Governor Stephen Pallaz and current Bank of Canada Governor Tiff Macklem go to Staples, buy a desk jet, and bring it back and print billions upon billions of dollars, then the answer is no. They did not print money. It wasn't physically printed. But did they create money to fund our way through the pandemic? During the pandemic, the federal government was obviously in need of a lot of money, as was everyone else, and they needed to borrow that money on the cheap. So the government sold billions of dollars worth of bonds to our banks, to the big banks we have here in Canada, which then sold those bonds to the Bank of Canada. The Bank of Canada paid for those bonds with settlement balances that were indeed created out of thin air. So when the Bank of Canada created billions of dollars worth of new money and injected that into the system, those billions of dollars went to the banks, went to the government, which then spent that money into existence, which circulated vis-a-vis government checks, loans at ultra low interest rates, mortgages, etc., etc. And to get an idea of how much settlement balance money the Bank of Canada created throughout COVID, let's take a look at this chart of its assets. If we look at the history, we're moving right along with a fairly unchanged assets sheet, and then 2020 hits and it explodes. So clearly the Bank of Canada was in fact doing a lot of purchasing. We had not only Government of Canada bonds, we had bonds from the provinces, we had mortgage-backed securities. The Bank of Canada was buying a lot of assets, putting a lot of money into the economy. But the Bank of Canada says in its tweet that these settlement balances do not permanently add funds to the Canadian economy. And this part is true. This is called quantitative tightening, which the Bank of Canada is doing right now. The Bank of Canada can engage in quantitative tightening, that is, removing all that money from the system in two different ways. They can either sell the bonds on the open market, those bonds that they're holding that they bought from the banks. That will remove that money from the market, as the banks will pay the Bank of Canada to get those bonds back, or they can let the bonds mature, meaning they allow the government to pay them back for those bonds without buying new bonds to replace them. So when the government pays them back for the bonds that they purchased, that is more money leaving the system. The bank bought those bonds from the banks, which bought those bonds from the government, and then the government is going to pay back those bonds to the Bank of Canada, thereby removing all of that money from the system. And as of June 30th, the Bank of Canada had gotten rid of 9% of its assets, meaning it sold or allowed them to mature, meaning 9% of that money that was created and spent into existence is no longer in the system. 9% of that money has been removed. So in that sense, the money that the bank created did work its way into the system in all sorts of manners and is now working its way out of the system. However, this does not mean that those funds created did not have a major impact on our inflation rate. Remember, those billions and billions of funds that were created out of thin air via settlement balances and put into the system, they've been working their way around in and around the Canadian economy for 2 years now. There was over 2 years there where all of that money was floating around, having more money available than goods, which by definition creates inflation. When there's too much money chasing too few goods, inflation will be the result. And I think the Bank of Canada knows this. I think they know when you or I say that the bank had turned on the money printer, that Bank of Canada Governor Tiff Macklem isn't running a desk jet out of his office. I think we all intuitively know that. When we say money printing, we mean creating money out of thin air, and that is indeed what they did. And that is indeed what most governments did throughout the pandemic. The United States, which pioneered quantitative easing during the 2008 financial crisis, has been a leader in QE, quantitative easing, as Europe did it as well.
Everybody's doing it.
And we are all seeing the effects of the creation of massive amounts of money throughout the world as our inflation rates go higher and higher. But as the bank does point out, they are tightening, they are removing money from the system, and they are raising interest rates, which is going to remove even more money from the system. Whether or not it will be enough to slow down Canada's inflation rate in a short order remains to be seen, but we'll obviously have updates out on that on this channel. If you want to get those updates, make sure you click like and subscribe. But for now, thanks so much for watching.